Let's talk about the Volkstaat. Just prior to the elections in 1994, an agreement was reached between the ruling party, that was the National Party, the ANC, and the then Vryheidsfront. It was also signed and witnessed by a host of international witnesses. It was not physically signed by Nelson Mandela at the time because he was not able to be present for the signing, but he did send a handwritten letter stating that he was in full support of the agreement as well. This agreement was called the Afrikaner Accord. In this agreement, it was agreed by the parties concerned that a Volkstaat would be allocated for the Boers or Afrikaners. Later, after the elections, Section 235 of the Constitution was created to enable not just self-determination for the Boer Afrikaners, but all groupings of people. The last sentence, however, of Section 235 states that this should only happen according to legislation. This legislation was at that stage not in existence. It still had to be created. In other words, this was the rules by which self-determination for any group could and would be accomplished. Unfortunately, that legislation was never tabled in Parliament and therefore has never been created. We know who we can thank for that, don't we? The Freedom Front Plus, Pieter Groenewald and his group of nepotistically appointed leaders, that's if there is such a word as nepotistically, have sat on that accord and the required legislation for the last 30 years without doing a single thing towards submitting the proposed legislation. It is for this reason that the Battle of Centurion took place on the 2nd of February, where we called for the resignation of the whole lot of them, all the senior leadership, for literally sabotaging the future of the Boere people and as a result causing untold persecution of the whites over the last 30 years. They literally have blood on their hands, the blood of thousands of farmers who were murdered on their farms since 1994 and other people. Anyway, that is not the subject of this episode. What I want to talk to you about is the viability or possibility of us actually being granted that Volkstaat as agreed upon way back then. I am no legal expert, but just looking at it from a purely legal standpoint, I would say that the Boere or Afrikaner people absolutely do have a claim to their Volkstaat. Purely on paper, I can't see how any court could deny it. Any court that abided by the law anyway. Unfortunately, for me, that is where the viability of the idea for me comes to an abrupt stop. In the last 30 years, the black population in South Africa has literally exploded. I don't have any exact figures, but I would guess that where there once were possibly 500,000 black people, there are now possibly 2 or 3 million. I would like to know what the people of the Volkstaat are going to do with those millions living in the area within the borders of this so-called Volkstaat, should they be granted it. Last week I had a debate with someone in a group I am in on WhatsApp. This man was promoting the Tabok court case where they are promoting the implementation of the Afrikaner Accord and want to take the matter to court to demand the Volkstaat, which I have actually got no problem with. However, I asked him what they were planning on doing with the millions living in the area allocated to the Volkstaat should they win their case in court, which I have no doubt they should, legally speaking. All he could answer was that they would be deported. He couldn't tell me where they would be deported to or how they were going to deport millions of people without a bloodbath. I eventually told him that he was living in a dream world. I could be wrong, but I have yet to hear about or see a plan that would be able to evacuate millions of people without an absolute bloodbath. 30 years ago, we had the military might to accomplish it, but not these days, not with the sheer numbers we are talking about now. I could very well be wrong about this, so I welcome anyone who could actually prove me wrong. In my opinion, there is only one possible solution that is both legal as well as viable, and that is for us to secede. If we want to avoid a lot of conflict, as well as bloodshed, secession is the only possibility. Of course, there is always the risk of the SANDF being set on us after secession is announced, but that is something we will have no control over. There are contingency plans in place should that happen, so it is not as big a threat as most would think. The SANDF are mostly a bunch of fat and unhealthy slobs with zero discipline or training anyway. I doubt they will be able to pose too much of a threat. You see, if they did attack us in the new country, they would be considered the aggressors and not us. It is very unfortunate that there are going to be many of us who, for whatever reason, are either not able or not willing to move to the new country and start afresh. Not much will change for them. They will still be living in this shithole called South Africa, with a murder rate that looks like a cricket score and a general crime rate that would make a jail gang proud. If people are happy to keep living under those circumstances, it is their right and nobody will try and force you to move anywhere. This, however, does not need to stop you from still giving your mandate and saying yes to secession right now. You will always be considered a citizen of the new country and would be welcome any time, should the going get too tough for you in South Africa. Currently, by the look of things, they already have close to 1.5 million mandates out of the required 2 million. So not too far to go, considering that the idea of secession is gaining in popularity among right-minded conservatives right now. I have it on good authority that secession is close at hand. There has been an enormous amount of work happening behind the scenes. So no matter where you live in South Africa or abroad, as long as you have a South African ID document, you are eligible to give your mandate and say yes to secession, and would be considered a citizen of the new country as soon as it is declared an independent sovereign state, no matter whether you intend moving to the new country or not. Personally, I think that within a few years, all who want to be living in the new country will be there, and the rest who don't want to will have to take their chances with what is left of safety and security in South Africa. I'm afraid that secession is to the minorities these days what the track was to the voortrekkers many years ago, except that this time we have nowhere to track to. Our only option now is to separate and remove ourselves from what is becoming an increasingly tyrannical regime before we are brutally attacked and killed publicly, and not just in isolated farm attacks on basically defenseless people when they are least expecting it. Secession is for the oppressed and persecuted an act of self-defense and self-preservation. We simply have no other choice and need to be proactive about the situation and not reactive after the fact. I would like to appeal to all those of you who have young children and grandchildren to please think of their future. You know as well as I do that in this country, they have little chance of a future today, and they will have even less of a future tomorrow. It is your duty as a parent or grandparent to give these children the best possible chance at a decent future. You owe it to them to say yes to secession right now, because although we don't know how much time we have before this whole country implodes into total chaos, it is becoming quite unanimous that total collapse is imminent. In other words, it could happen at any time now. You could even tell this from listening to the budget speech yesterday. As another commentator said, it was like listening to a doctor tell his patient that they were terminally ill. The ANC government is morally, financially, and ethically bankrupt. They now have nothing more they can offer, so they are now going to draw more money out of you and I, as well as make more debt, of course. Here's an interesting fact for you. Did you know that the ANC government's debt is so high right now that each and every citizen, that's you and I, no matter whether you are 95 years old or were born this morning, owes close to 80,000 Rand. Yes, you heard that right. You listening to this owes close to 80,000 Rand. You see, a government's debt is actually your debt, because the government can only get money from its citizens. In other words, we owe that amount of money. Here's another interesting fact. If we should secede, we literally leave all that debt with those that created it, namely the ANC government. We are then free to start afresh with a clean slate. Doesn't that sound like a good idea to you? Please give me a like, share this as much as possible, and of course, subscribe. You have absolutely nothing to lose. Until next time, be safe out there.